Hi everyone. After a super engaging fireside chat on creating digital spaces equipped for adaptable transformation, it is now time to discuss innovation. In this intriguing session for track 1 of NexTech Southeast Asia HR Summit 2021, we bring to you several dynamics of innovation. In this session, our speaker will highlight 5 ways to innovate, the problems with innovation, and how corporates are dealing with it. COVID-19 has upended nearly every aspect of our lives in unprecedented ways, and accelerating innovation has become more critical than ever before. As a response to the widespread disruptions, HR professionals and other corporate leaders are expected to build a stellar innovation capability that will help them deal with anything that comes their way in this new world of work. While we see these positive developments as just innovation, there is definitely more to it than what meets the eye. To delve deeper into this super insightful innovation cycle, the associated challenges, and the way forward, it is my pleasure to invite our speaker for this session, Amer Iqbal, Head of Digital Transformation at Facebook, Singapore. Amer is the Head of Digital Transformation at Facebook, Singapore. As an industry thought leader, a strategist, and as a facilitator, Amer has helped scale several companies and startups from the ground up over the 2 decades. Applauded for his remarkable strategies, Amer was a finalist for the 2011 Young Executive of the Year and has been featured in numerous publications over the years. So without any further ado, over to you, Amer.
Hi, I'm Amer Iqbal, and today we're talking about my favorite topic, corporate innovation. Specifically, we're going to answer one question today. Can HR enable corporate innovation? And spoiler alert, the short answer is yes. But what we're going to do is deep dive into 3 areas to get to the detailed answer. We'll talk about the problem with innovation, the most common hurdles that corporates face when they're undertaking their innovation agenda. We'll talk about the 5 ways to innovate, which is my framework that explains the most common approaches that companies take to innovation. And finally, we'll talk about HR-led innovation, which is how you as HR leaders and HR practitioners can be not just partners, but actually co-creators and collaborators in driving and shaping that innovation agenda. So, let me start with a question. Who can tell me what this is a picture of? If you answered the Wright Brothers, you would be correct. You would also demonstrate that you can read the words on the screen. But of course, this is a picture of one of the most game-changing moments in human history, the Wright brothers performing the first human flight. So Wilbur and Orville Wright conquered human flight on December 17th, 1903. And if you think about what they achieved, they actually changed the course of human history. The way I like to put it, it was very understandable. A dude got into a box and turned into a bird. It was like magic, right? But here's the issue. Nobody actually reported on this in the news media until 4 years after the first flight. There was one interview around about that time with a so-called industry expert who was a hot air balloon tycoon who said, you know what, human flight, it's just one of those things. It's probably not possible. Maybe in the way off distant future, we can have some version of it, but it's just not really feasible. Now, this was a full year after the Wright brothers had already completed the first flight. So it brings us to a real issue here and the first problem with innovation. Innovation is hard to see. Often we see this gap between a game changer occurring and people recognizing that the game has been changed. And so what we see from the Wright brothers story is that even people who were there in Dayton, Ohio, they saw it with their own 2 eyes. They said, well, this needs to be some sort of a trick. They can't really be flying, right? They were first-hand witnesses. Now, even experts, not just regular folks, often make this mistake and fail to see game changers as they're occurring. So when the telephone was invented, for example, Western Union owned the telegraph lines, and therefore you would have said they were the industry leaders in telephony. They said, nah, this telephone, it's never going to be a real thing. US Congress issued a memo when the automobile was invented saying, yeah, you know what? Automobiles will never replace horse and carriage. It's just not going to be feasible. So again and again throughout history, we see these examples where so-called industry experts fail to see the game changer occurring in front of them. And that's a problem. The second big problem with innovation is it happens gradually over time. So Andy Jassy, the CEO of Amazon, back when he was starting up AWS, Amazon Web Services, he talked to the difference between invention and innovation. One of the myths in the innovation game is around this light bulb moment where a moment of inspiration comes along and it changes the game in and of itself. But that's much more to do with invention than it is to do with innovation. And so Andy Jassy talked about that journey. In the early days of Amazon Web Services, companies wrote it off. They said, well, this is kind of a cute little toy. Maybe startups will use it one day. It will never be suitable for the enterprise. And it was years until cloud computing was taken seriously. Fast forward to today, there's not an IT department on the planet who doesn't have some sort of cloud infrastructure or planning for their cloud strategy. So clearly, innovation isn't a light bulb moment. It happens gradually over time. Finally, innovation requires us to change. And this is possibly the biggest problem with innovation. We measure and incentivize innovation in all of the wrong ways. We've seen examples of things like innovation bonuses. You're trying to incentivize innovation, which is a long-term, generational, quite a messy thing, in the same way that you reward salespeople who can quite directly correlate action A resulted in result B. It's just not the same thing. So we're looking at innovation in a lot of these cases in totally the wrong way. Similarly, we hear a lot of talk from corporates around embracing failure, fail fast, fail forward. There's a lot of talk about it and talk around it. But in terms of really putting your money where your mouth is and embracing that at a corporate level, we still see very few examples of where this is being done well. And so all of these things are tough to do, we understand. But without actually changing ourselves, we have no hope of changing the organization, and therefore it doesn't serve the innovation agenda. So, 3 key problems with innovation. Innovation is hard to see, it happens gradually, and it requires us to change. Form huge stumbling blocks and explain why there is so much churn around the innovation industry, and we hear so much talk about innovation theater. They are hard hurdles to overcome, but they're not insurmountable. And here's where we come to the 5 ways to innovate. So this was a piece of analysis, a framework that was born out of some work that I did a few years back in my consulting days with my team. We analyzed close to 100 different companies and looked at all of the various different ways that companies are innovating. Now, it's true, there are hundreds of different innovation approaches, all with hundreds of different names. But when we really started to look at the overlaps and find the commonalities, you can explain about 80 to 90% of the corporate innovation approaches using just 5 key buckets or key categorizations of innovation initiatives. So I'll walk you through those, and then at the end we'll talk about the strategy. So the first really common one that we see are upskilling programs. We want to be a more innovative company, therefore let's make our people more innovative. It directly tries to tackle the problem at the heart, and what we see this manifesting is internal universities, agile training programs, rolling out large-scale certification, basically building up those capabilities within our own workforce and our own people. Now, these can be great because they tackle the heart of the problem, but equally what we often see with these in terms of a limitation is rather than actually leading from the front of the industry, what they tend to end up doing is bringing up the rear. The second common one that we see are innovation hubs. So we've all seen a version of an innovation lab. If you've ever seen in your office people walking around in jeans and black t-shirts and there's some room with bean bags and a beer fridge somewhere, you know what I'm talking about. Most corporates on the planet have some sort of an investment in a hub or a lab of some description. Again, they're good because it means we can start to attract the type of talent that we need in order to be a more innovative company. We can start to attract technologists and entrepreneurs and design thinkers and this sort of talent and put them to work on really tomorrow's business type problems. One of the biggest challenges that we see with this is how do we cross-pollinate the outputs of these innovation teams back to the core organization? And as we know, every organization on the planet has an immune system to change. And this is where we start to see some of that resistance come up when it comes to actually taking the great outputs from the innovation teams and incorporating those back into the core. The third one is possibly one of the most interesting, and it's one of the more recent ones that we've seen come up. We call it a startup studio. So this is where a company says, well, the goal of innovation is to build the business of tomorrow. So why don't we just go out and build a startup, build a venture right now that could potentially become the business of tomorrow? And usually it's not just one venture, there will be multiple ventures, but it directly aims at building the business of tomorrow. We understand that we possibly don't have the capabilities to build those kind of startups. So we're going to bring in some external help from consultants and other types of external capabilities. But they will effectively be like a venture or a startup operating within the umbrella of a corporate. And so these are quite interesting. Again, they solve for the problem of let's build tomorrow's business. But some of the limitations that we start to see is, well, what about all of those people back in the core organization? Sometimes they can feel a little bit left out in the cold when it comes to the innovation agenda. And equally, we can start to see the core organization sometimes imposing some of the processes, technologies, some of the limitations from the core onto these ventures rather than just letting them operate as startups as they probably should be free to do. The fourth one that we see are incubators, and we lump accelerators in here where you've got early stage or later stage startups basically housed in an external environment. You bring them in, you give them some funding, and you let these startups do their thing. It's great from a de-risking failure point of view because the corporate isn't looking at it as, hey, we're failing. It's looking at, well, they're just startups doing their thing in their own environment. The tricky part can be when it comes to making investment cases, and we've seen a lot of these incubators fall down maybe 2 or 3 cohorts in where the board is kind of saying, okay, well, we played around with some startups a little bit, but what did we really see in terms of immediate financial gains? So again, that the ability to measure and understand the long-term impact of these innovation initiatives can sometimes be the downfall when we talk about interacting with the startup ecosystem. And speaking of ecosystems, that kind of is the fifth play that we see, which is the most passive, which is typically when a company says, well, we'll set up some sort of sensing and scanning capability. We'll look at all of the IoT or all of the fintech startups that are operating out there. We'll assess them. Maybe we'll partner with a few of them to build some POCs. And then eventually we'll see where rubber hits the road and we can make some investment decisions around acquisitions or partnerships or the like. And so this is the most passive version. It's great because it's very low investment upfront. You only invest where you need to, but it's also a very long-term and a very passive view, which for a lot of corporations, they may feel that they need that sense of control rather than just sitting back and letting the market do the work. So we just talked through the 5 ways to innovate, and here's where it starts to get interesting. When we lay out those 5 ways to innovate across a spectrum, what we see is a real pattern. From the left side, where we see upskilling and innovation hubs, it's a very invested innovation approach. We're going to take on the innovation agenda internally with our people and build the capability from within. At the other end of the spectrum, we see a divested innovation approach. Let's sit back, we'll be a bit more passive, we'll let the market do the work, and then dip in opportunistically when the time is right. And now making decisions around this are very, very important. Laying down the principles and strategic decisioning around, as an organization, do we want to be in the driver's seat of building tomorrow's business? Do we have the capability? Are we honest enough to say, hey, we will keep up the investment and keep ramping that up over time? Or are we better off taking a more divested approach because that's probably not something that we can bite off right now in a big way? Let's let the market do some of the work and then reassess as we go. These sorts of decisions are really, really critical and often aren't taken seriously enough when companies are embarking on their innovation approach. And the final piece I'll say on this framework is the most successful innovators treat innovation like a portfolio. So the first question I get asked when I present this is typically, well, sure, there are 5 ways to innovate, but which is the best way to innovate? And the answer to that is, well, if you look at the most innovative companies on the planet, they're not just investing in one of these 5. If you look at Alphabet, Amazon, Apple, these companies are investing across all 5 ways to innovate. And in fact, they have multiple bets and multiple initiatives across each of those 5. If a company is going to have any hope of succeeding in their innovation agenda, it really needs to look a lot more like a portfolio. And our guidance typically is any company who's serious about innovation should be playing in at least 3 of these 5. And you can use a spread investment decision like a 70, 20, 10, something like that to spread your bets across a portfolio. But just making one bet is rarely the way that companies succeed in terms of building a successful innovation operation. Okay, so let's talk HR. What is the role of HR leadership and HR practitioners in shaping and driving and having a seat at the table when it comes to building tomorrow's business? Well, here's one of the key principles and one of the key hurdles that we see for HR teams. We've seen lots of examples of companies who are approaching an invested innovation approach. They've chosen upskilling, for example, and we're going to roll out Agile as a new way of working across the entire organization. We're going to build the Agile org. Great. And then HR gets involved. They help to set up the structures, the processes, the training, all these sorts of things around building that new Agile org. But what we then see is, well, they're still doing the same work. It was a bank that used to do banking. Now they're Agile and they still do banking. Well, they didn't fundamentally change the features, products, or business models in terms of building the business of tomorrow. And so in those cases, that's where HR almost gets sidelined in terms of just serving new ways of working. It's not bad in and of itself. It helps work get done more effectively, faster, maybe, but it's not necessarily delivering impact against the innovation agenda. What we need to do as HR leadership is think about not just changing how we do work, but changing the work that we do in service of building the business of tomorrow. And that's ultimately what any innovation initiative should be laddering up to. And in that sense, you may still choose to roll out an agile organization, but it will be done in a very different way. And the implementation may be done with a different lens in service of building the business of tomorrow. So that's key strategic decision number 1, where HR should be involved. The second one is this, and this is a big one for HR. Are we taking an invested or a divested approach? Obviously, the more towards the invested side of the scale the innovation approach is, the more HR will be involved, the more responsibility HR will have in terms of driving the innovation agenda, and the more ownership HR will be able to have in terms of shaping what that future business looks like. However, let's just say this, not every company on the planet has the capabilities or will be able to compete with the digital disruptors in their industry. And this is where it's very, very important to make some pragmatic decisions around where will we play as a HR organization in terms of building that internal capability. Should we be looking at upskilling and labs as a means of supplementing maybe some of the more ecosystem type plays, because we understand there are some capabilities we're just not going to catch up on in the short term. Maybe we're better off partnering with others in the ecosystem and then blending those two worlds together. And that's a very key strategic decision that HR needs to be involved in, because if you're not involved in it, it will be imposed by the business. Now, I'm going to end with a case study of good HR-led innovation. Union Bank is a bank in the Philippines who I had the pleasure of working with as a consultant a number of years ago. And look, they're no stranger to firsts. In the Philippines, the market they operate in, they were one of the first with internet banking, with open API platforms, etc. So they're no strangers to innovation. By 2018, they'd grown to the 7th largest bank in the Philippines, but they had a real recognition in order to get from 7th to 1st, just playing catch up and copying the big guys was not going to be their path to success. So they set a very lofty innovation ambition, which was to say the business of tomorrow will be a data technology business with banking utilities. And that was a great aspiration and a great vision for them to set. And so then we all got to work in saying, okay, well, how would that be brought to life? They understood that technology was a part of it, but equally, whatever technology we can do, others can do the same technology. That's just the equalizer. Truly, the differentiator will come from our people. And so the initiative was led by HR. The CHRO was a key sponsor in driving all of this program. And in fact, they'd already been doing a lot of the right things. They had built an innovation hub. They were running hackathons. They'd been rolling out agile training across the organization. But these initiatives had been kind of isolated and piecemeal, and so therefore weren't really building up to achieving that vision yet of building the data technology business of tomorrow. And so the work we did with them was to say, how do we consolidate all of that work together and drive the innovation agenda so that it's not just changing how we work, but actually delivering on that future business. And so we rolled out network-based teams across the organization along with HR. That was key to unlocking some of the benefits of the agile training that had been going on. And so within a very quick period of time, what we were able to do was stand up squads who were self-managing, operating in agile, and were able to make business decisions without going through layers and layers of process. And so all of a sudden, we had what we called speed boats popping up within the organization. And we realized rather than just building the speed boats, actually what HR needed to do was build and own a speedboat factory. Any one of these speed boats or ventures could become part of the future business of tomorrow. Let's build a factory that's capable of launching many of these speedboats, experimenting, testing, and failing quickly, and gradually building more and more muscle and DNA of that future business of tomorrow. And so the results of all of that were great. Within the first 6 months, not only had they managed to set up the speedboat factory, but they'd already launched the first 5 speedboats. And in fact, one of those went on to win most innovative digital banking product in the Philippines that year that it was launched. They've since gone on to win many awards and lots of success. But it was a great example of HR really not just having a seat at the table, but really taking charge and leading that innovation agenda in terms of building the data technology business of tomorrow. Well, thank you. I'm going to leave it there. My name is Amer Iqbal. I hope you've enjoyed this talk and you've gotten something out of it. If you want to stay in touch, please feel free to visit 5waystoinnovate.com, and I hope to see you soon. Bye.
Thank you so much for these amazing insights, Amer. It is absolutely true that HR leaders and professionals are not just partners, but also co-creators and collaborators in driving and shaping the innovation agenda. These were some remarkable examples and case studies and a great learning experience for all of us. Thank you so much for joining us, and stay tuned for the next amazing lineup of sessions waiting for you. Also, please don't forget to share your insights with us in the chat box. Coming up next is another thought-provoking panel discussion on the topic, the CIO-CHRO dynamic duo, fueling business optimization. The session will be moderated by Yasmin Taj, the editor of ETHRWorld International. So see you all there, and over to you, Yasmin.